There are places a woman is not supposed to go when everything she owned has been taken from her, and the ravine at the back of the Callaway parcel was one of them. That is what Harlan Pruitt told anyone who would listen in the autumn of 1887, when I first started carrying my things down the switchback trail with a mule named Cobb and a shepherd mix I called Fen at my heels. Harlan ran the feed store on the main road through Greer Hollow, and he had opinions the way some men have land, in abundance and without apology. And his opinion of what I was doing was stated plainly one October morning from the top rail of the fence, while I hauled a load of rough-cut planking past him. He said I was building my tomb. He said it without cruelty, almost with pity, the way a man tells a child that the stove will burn her, and then he went back inside. I did not know it then, and I would not have believed it if someone had told me. But the day Harlan Pruitt stood on that fence rail and pronounced my death was the first day of the only life that has ever truly been mine. What I didn't yet understand, on that October morning with my hands raw from the rope and my boots already soaked through, was that the ravine was not a grave. It was a shelter waiting for someone who knew how to read it. I was 23 years old that autumn, and I had nothing. My husband Clem had died in the spring, not in any dramatic fashion, only of the fever that moved through the valley that year and took 6 men and 3 children before it spent itself. And the 2 years of backnote he had run at the Greer Hollow Mercantile came due in August with his name no longer attached to them and mine the only one left to attach. The mercantile man, whose name was Aldous Cole, was not unkind, but he was also not interested in waiting, and the cottage and its half-cleared acre went to settle the note in September, which left me with Cobb and Fen and the tools, and the cast iron, and the good wool blanket my mother's sister had made, and the Callaway parcel at the ravine's edge, which Clem had held on a 20-year homestead claim and which was mine now, though it produced nothing anyone would call a living. The Callaway land was 60 acres of ridge and draw, and the 40 acres on the ridge were limestone shelf and thin soil, good for grazing if you had the animals to put there, which I did not. The 20 acres in the ravine were considered worthless by every man who had looked at them, including Clem, including his father before him, including Aldous Cole when he assessed the note. They were steep and wet and overhung with old oak and hemlock, and the creek ran through the bottom in a channel that swelled in snowmelt and shrank to a thread in August, and the walls of the cut rose maybe 30 feet on the north side and 22 on the south. Nobody in Greer Hollow had ever tried to winter in such a place. Nobody with any sense, Harlan would add. Nobody who meant to be found in the spring. What they did not know, and what I had not yet had the language to name, was that my father had wintered in a place very much like it. Not in Greer Hollow, not in Virginia at all, but in the draw country north of the Susquehanna when he was young and starting and had less than I had. And he had done it with a method I had watched every winter of my childhood, without fully understanding what I was watching. My father's name was George Vane, and he died when I was 15, taken by a falling limb while clearing second growth. And he left no money because he had never accumulated any worth speaking of. But he left me the knowledge of how a ravine wall behaves in winter, how the north face of a cut hoards heat, the way a stone hoards warmth from a fire, how cold air pools on flat ground and slides down and away from the sheltered vertical, how a structure built into the earth rather than set upon it borrows from the ground's own steady temperature the way a child borrows warmth from a sleeping parent. He had never said it in those exact words. He had said it by example, by the way he sited the root cellar, by the way he banked the berm against the house's north wall each November, by the way he would press his palm flat against the ravine wall in December and say, "Feel that, Dora," and wait for me to register the difference. The limestone held what the air could not. That was the lesson. It took me until I was a widow at 23 to understand that I had inherited it. I began in the first week of October, when the oak leaves were still mostly on, but the nights had turned cold enough to see breath. And I worked every day from first light until the light failed, which in the ravine came earlier than on the ridge because of the walls, and which I had accounted for. The structure I was building was not a cabin in any way the men of Greer Hollow would have recognized as such. It was set back 6 feet into the north wall of the cut, the limestone face carved back by hand and by a small charge of blasting powder I had purchased in Holt's Crossing, 20 miles off, where no one knew me or my business. The floor was 3 feet below the level of the ravine's floor, which put it 6 feet below the line of heavy frost penetration, and I had my father's arithmetic for why that mattered, though I did not have a number to put on it, only the feel of his palm against cold stone and the memory of a January morning when the temperature outside the root cellar read 18 below and the cellar itself read 38 above. The walls I built from the native limestone, fitted dry and then chinked with clay dug from the creek bank, 2 feet thick on the windward side and 18 inches on the others. The roof was the piece that drew the most comment later, because it was not the peaked shake roof anyone expected, but a low curved vault of bent sapling and sod, tamped down over 3 layers of straw and a course of fitted flat stone, so that from the ridge above you could not see that anything had been built there at all. Only the entrance showed, a low door cut into the south-facing slope with an angled exterior windbreak of stacked stone, and even that looked from any distance like a feature of the hillside rather than a work of human hands. The 3rd week of October brought a woman named Ida Marsh down the trail to see what the noise was about, Ida being the widow who kept the 3-acre kitchen garden at the road's edge, and who had more curiosity than most people in the valley were comfortable admitting to. She stood at the ravine's lip in her good brown coat and watched me for a while without speaking, which I appreciated. And then she came down the last switchback and stood 10 feet from the wall and looked at the course of stone I had laid, and at the angle of the entrance cut, and at the clay buckets lined along the creek. She asked what I was building, and I told her it was a house, and she asked where the chimney went, and I showed her the ventilation slot I planned at the roofline. Not a chimney exactly, but a clay-capped slot cut at an angle that would pull foul air upward and outward without admitting wind, and she stood very still looking at it for a long time. She said, "Your father built like this, I think." And I said yes. And she said, "I remember hearing that." And then she went back up the trail without further comment. Ida Marsh was the only person in Greer Hollow who did not express an opinion about what I was building in the ravine, which was perhaps the rarest courtesy anyone extended to me that year. And it cost her something, because Harlan Pruitt asked her what she thought, and she told him she had no view on the matter. And Harlan received that answer with the expression of a man who suspects he is being corrected without being told so. I chinked the walls in late October, a full day of pressing wet clay into the courses with a wooden paddle, Cobb carried down in 2 trips, and I put the first course of sod on the vault frame in the last days of the month, tamping it down in the late afternoon when the clay beneath had stiffened enough to hold. The ventilation slot I sealed with a fitted clay plug I could remove or replace from inside, which gave me control of the air exchange that a fixed chimney would not, and which was the piece of the design I was least certain about until the first cold night proved it. My father had used a similar plug on his root cellar and had shown me how it worked, pulling the plug on cold, clear nights to let the dense, cold air sink in and displace the stale, warm air near the floor, then sealing it again before morning so the stone held what it had gathered. The principle was the same in a dwelling, only the scale was larger and the balance more delicate, and I practiced it through October until I understood the timing, the way you understand a door's latch by the feel of it in your hand. without looking. Harlan Pruitt did not see the roof and walls when he looked. He saw a hole. He said so on the 1st of November when he came down to the ravine with Ed Daly from the grain cooperative and looked over the lip at what I had built. And Harlan said it plain. She's dug herself a hole and she plans to crawl into it before the ground freezes. And I'll say a prayer for her in December and a longer one in March. Ed Daly was quieter, the way a man is when he is not entirely sure he is right. And he said, "Dora, that roof won't carry 6 feet of snow." And I said, "It won't have to carry it. It will shed it." And he looked at the curve of the sod vault and pressed his lips together and said, "Nothing more." That was Ed Daly's way, to fall silent rather than argue, which I had come to understand was not agreement but a form of waiting to see. I did not mind the waiting. I had enough of my own to do. There are those who build by standing back and deciding, and those who build by working their way forward through the material. And I was of the second kind, the way my father had been, feeling the principle in the doing of it before I could name it in words. Fen slept inside the entrance that first night of November, sprawled across the threshold with her nose toward the ravine as she always slept, and I remember looking at her from the low doorway and thinking that she had chosen well without knowing what she chose. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees above by the reading on the small glass thermometer I had nailed to the entrance post, and inside at the floor level it read 41. The stone held its warmth the way my father had said. I wrote the 2 numbers in the small ledger I kept, and I wrote them again every morning through November and into December. And the pattern was steady. The outside could drop 20 degrees in a night, and the inside would not move more than 3. I did not tell this to anyone in Greer Hollow. I had no reason to think they would believe a ledger any more than they believed my explanation. And besides, I had no desire to be proven right by words when the winter itself would speak plainly enough in time. The days settled into their own rhythm, one I had not expected to find comfortable, but which suited me with a completeness I had not known in the cottage. I rose before full light and opened the ventilation plug for 20 minutes while I built the morning fire, and in that time the stone would give back what the night had given it, and the interior temperature, which never fell below 38 on the coldest November nights, would recover to 40 or 41 by the time I sealed the plug and turned to the bread and the porridge. Fen would stretch and move to the warm side of the floor near the stove, and I would listen to Cobb shifting in his overhang 60 feet down the ravine, and the creek would talk its low November talk, and the day would begin in a quiet that I came to understand was not loneliness but its opposite, the deep, undisturbed attention that is only available when the world has stopped expecting things from you. I put up 6 cords of dry oak split and stacked in the entrance windbreak by the end of November, where the stone walls kept the moisture off, and 6 cords struck me as sufficient, in the same way that it had struck my father as sufficient, not laughable, only calibrated to what the stone would ask of the stove, which was not heat so much as it was maintenance, the small, steady fire that gives the stone permission to do its own work. The second time Harlan used the word was at the Greer Hollow Church social in late November, when a group of the older homesteaders stood near the pie table, and the conversation turned, as it did in November, to wood supply. Ed Daly said he had put up 11 cords and thought he might want 1 more. A man named Birch Tenney said he had 9 and was not worried. Harlan said 12 and counting, and then looked at me across the room where I stood with a cup of cider and said, "Of course the widow in the hole doesn't burn wood, does she? She sits in the dark and prays the earth is warmer than the air." The room moved to laughter, the light, self-satisfied laughter of people who have heard their own unspoken conclusion voiced and feel confirmed. And I did not smile or reply, I only drank my cider, because the laughter did not cost me anything, and replying would have. Fen was outside tied to the fence post, and when I went out to untie her, she pressed her shoulder against my leg, and we walked home together in the dark, down the switchback trail, into the ravine where the temperature at the entrance post read 29 outside and 43 inside, and I wrote both numbers in the ledger and went to sleep. December moved slowly and with increasing purpose, the way a season does when it has decided to be remembered. The first 2 weeks were cold but conventional, the kind of cold that the Ridge homesteads handled with their usual competence and their usual reserves, and Harlan's 12 cords and Birch Tenney's 9 sat in their respective woodsheds looking like everything anyone could need. I watched the sky from the ravine in the way my father had taught me to watch it, not for the dramatic signals that anyone could read, but for the flat gray quality that comes before a sustained cold, the sky that is not building toward a storm, but settling into a position it plans to hold. And in the third week of December, the sky above the ridge took on that quality, a dense, even overcast with no variation in it. The kind of sky that does not move or shift or threaten, but simply waits. And I looked at my 6 cords in the windbreak and decided I was satisfied with 6. The cold that arrived on the 15th was steady rather than sharp, the temperature holding at 8 below for 3 days, without the wind that would usually come with such a reading and go. And the old men in the valley said to each other at the road that it had the feel of something long, and they were correct in a way that would cost some of them dearly. The third time Harlan gave the structure its name was at the Crossroads store on the 20th of December, where I had gone to collect the glass jar of isinglass I had ordered for the ventilation plug seal, and where he stood behind the counter in his canvas apron with 2 other men I did not know well. Farmers from the next valley come for supplies before the road hardened further, and he introduced me without particular thought as the woman from the hole in the ravine. And the 2 strangers looked at me with the polite blankness of men encountering a local peculiarity they have no context for. And Harlan added, "She's built herself into the hillside like a ground squirrel." And the 2 strangers smiled, and I paid for my isinglass and thanked the girl behind the secondary counter and went out to where Cobb stood patient at the rail. I was not bothered by what Harlan said. I was thinking about the quality of the sky above the road, the same settled gray that had been there for a week, and the temperature at the post I'd read that morning, which was 19 below, and the way the creek in the ravine bottom had gone from its usual winter murmur to a deep intermittent creak, the sound ice makes when the cold is moving through it from the top down. And I thought, it is coming soon. And I drove Cobb home through the early dark and added 2 sticks to the stove and sealed the plug and wrote 19 below in the ledger. If you have stayed this long, I think you know what is coming, and I am glad you are here. Leave a word if this story finds you somewhere familiar. The knowing of it seems worth carrying together. December came cold and came early, which the old-timers said was a sign, and they were correct in a way they had not meant. The first real snow fell on the 9th and put 6 inches on the ridge by morning, and the temperature held at 5 above for 3 days, and then dropped to 8 below on the 15th and held there. In the ravine, the entrance post read 22 below on the night of the 16th, when the wind came off the north ridge and drove through Greer Hollow like something with a purpose, and inside, at floor level, it read 39. I burned a single candle and the small tin stove no bigger than a washpot, burning dry oak in quantities that would have seemed laughable to Harlan Pruitt, half a cord for the whole month of December at most, because the stone did not require heating so much as it required the small nudge of supplemental warmth to stay above the range where breathing becomes difficult and joints begin to ache without relief. Cobb was in the natural overhang 60 feet down the ravine that I had fitted with a low stone wall and a roof of pole and sod matching the houses, and he stood in 10 degrees more warmth than the ravine floor offered, which was 30 degrees more than the ridge. He was fine. Fen was inside with me. We were both fine. The second week of January was the week that settled the question, and it settled it in the way of all true catastrophes, not by asking permission but by arriving with the arithmetic of its own justice. The temperature fell on the 7th to 26 below, and on the 8th it fell to 31, and on the 9th it fell to 37 below zero by the reading at the post outside, which was the coldest I had ever felt, a January in Virginia, the coldest anyone in the county could remember, and it held there for 4 days without breaking. The snow on the ridge was 3 feet of compacted pack and still coming. The creek in the ravine bottom was locked solid, the sound of it simply gone, replaced by a silence that had weight to it, the silence of cold too complete to leave room for water. Fen slept. Cobb stood. The interior of the house through all 4 days did not fall below 36, though it touched that number on the night of the 9th when the outside held at 38 below, and I built the tin stove up and kept watch, and it recovered to 41 by morning. What was happening on the ridge I did not know for certain until Ed Daly came down the switchback trail on the 13th, when the worst of it had just begun to ease, and told me. He told me flat and without decoration, in the manner of a man who has been badly shaken and has not yet found the words to ornament it. Birch Tenney's youngest, a boy of 8, had suffered cold injury to both feet when the kitchen fire went out in the night on the 10th and could not be rebuilt, the woodpile's 2 remaining cords having gone wet under the weight of snow on the woodshed roof that had finally given way on the 8th. The Daly house had burned 11 of its 12 cords by the morning of the 11th, and Ed had spent the last 3 days burning furniture. The widow Holt, 3 miles east, had lost her milk cow and her 2 remaining hens. Across the valley's 7 main homesteads, the count, when it was finally tallied, was this: 2 families had abandoned their houses for the church building in the valley center, where the congregation kept a large central hearth and pooled their wood and sheltered 11 people through the worst 4 days, burning 8 cords total for the group and still reading 48 degrees at floor level on the coldest night, which was safety but not comfort. One family had gone to relations in Holt's Crossing and left their stock to chance. One family had managed alone, but at the cost of their woodpile's entire reserve. The ridge was a place of spent resources and careful counting. The ravine was a place where the candle was still burning, and there was oak remaining. I had not gone up to offer. It was not my place to offer, and they would not have come, not yet. But Ed Daly had come down, which was its own kind of speech, and he stood at the entrance post and looked at the number on the thermometer, which read 14 outside and 41 inside, in the middle of January, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he reached out and put his hand flat against the stone wall of the entrance, the way a man checks whether a kettle is warm, and held it there. And I watched his expression and thought of my father's palm pressed against the ravine wall with that small, patient smile. Ed pulled his hand back. The silence between us lasted several seconds. He said, "Dora, you built into the hill." That was all. 3 short syllables of recognition, quiet as a man learning something he should have understood years before. No theater in it. No apology either, but I had not needed one, and I would not have known what to do with one if it had been offered. I said yes, the way my father taught me. Ed nodded once and looked up at the sod roof and the stone vault and the curve of the entrance, and then he looked out at the ravine and the overhang where Cobb stood watching us with his mild equine attention, and then he turned and went back up the trail without another word. And I went inside where Fen was lying by the tin stove, and I put my hand flat against the interior wall and held it there, and felt what I always felt, the steady, unremarkable warmth of stone that had been learning its business since before any of us were born. What spread through Greer Hollow in the spring was not the story exactly, but a kind of practical urgency that overtook the story before it could be properly told. Ed Daly came back in March with his oldest son, a boy of 16 named Callum, and asked if they could see the building. I showed them everything: the berm angle, the vault curve, the depth of the floor below grade, the thickness of the north wall, the ventilation slot I'd cut near the roofline that let foul air out without letting cold in. And Ed's son wrote things in a small book with a pencil. And Ed himself watched and asked questions that were good questions, the kind a man asks when he is trying to understand a principle rather than copy a shape. That distinction mattered more than I would have predicted. The man who came later that spring, and there were 6 of them, including Harlan Pruitt, who came without the toothpick he usually worked at the corner of his mouth and stood with his hat in his hands. Those men mostly looked at the form and copied the form, and their structures the following winter were warmer than what they had had before. But not as warm as what I had built, because they had the shape without the understanding, the vault without the depth below grade, the stone wall without the berm. Ed and Callum, who had written things down and asked where the principal lived rather than where the planks went, built a structure the following November that held 38 degrees on a night of 29 below, which was a result within 4 degrees of my own, and that was knowledge traveling correctly, the inheritance landing in hands that had understood what they held. Harlan came in May, as I said, hat in hand, and he asked 3 questions and stood looking at the entrance for a long time, and then said, "I called it a hole," and I said, "So you did." That was the extent of the accounting between us, and it was sufficient. He built nothing that year, but he stopped talking, which was its own form of tribute, and the following spring he rebuilt his root cellar using the berm angle I had described to him, and the root vegetables kept through the winter at a quality he had not seen before, and he told people so when they asked, in the same plain-spoken way he had told them everything else, without embellishment and without mentioning the fence rail. I stayed in the ravine for 11 more years, until the second Clem, as I had come to think of the place, felt too small for what I had accumulated around it. The garden plot I had cut into the south-facing slope above the entrance, the extended overhang I had built out for Cobb and the 3 additional animals I kept by the 4th year, the small second chamber I had dug for storage and which stayed within 4 degrees of 40 all year round, keeping the root vegetables and the smoked meat and the glass-sealed jars of summer fruit in a condition that other people in the valley traveled to see. In 1898, I moved to the Ridge, to a new house built with the principles the ravine had taught me, half bermed on the north side, vaulted at the entry, the root cellar dug 6 feet into the hillside rather than sunk into the flat. And it was a warmer house by 15 degrees in January than any conventional frame structure in the valley, and people who came to visit noticed it before I had said a word, the way you notice when a room is unexpectedly kind. The ravine structure stood. I did not pull it down when I moved, and neither did the man who leased the Callaway parcel after me, a Norwegian named Arn, who had come from the Northern Territories and understood immediately what he was looking at and used the second chamber as a dairy cellar for 20 years, keeping his butter and his rounds of hard cheese in a condition that brought buyers from Holt's Crossing and as far as Roanoke in the end. Arn's daughter, Britt, learned the principle, not the shape, the principle, from watching her father explain it to the buyers who asked, and she applied it when she built her own homestead south of Greer Hollow in 1914. And the structure she built was the one that a man from the State Agricultural Office visited in the winter of 1917 and wrote about in the Quarterly Bulletin, calling it an example of vernacular thermal engineering, which was a phrase I never would have used, but which I think my father would have recognized as a way of saying what he had tried to tell me with his palm against cold stone. Fan lived 12 years, which is a long life for a dog of her kind. and she is buried under the east wall of the Ravine structure, which was where she chose to sleep in her last summer, in the cool shade that the overhang cast in the afternoons, and where I found her one morning in August of 1899, with her nose toward the ravine as she had always slept and gone. I stood there for a long time before I went to get the spade, and the wall was warm behind me in the August heat, the stone giving back what the long summer had pressed into it. And I thought of all the cold mornings she had lain at the entrance in the dark, between me and whatever the valley had to offer. And I thought of how my father would have liked her, the quiet competence of her, the way she had chosen the right place without being told. Cobb went in 1893, which was older than most mules are asked to live, and he is in the lower pasture of the Callaway parcel, in ground that is still unmarked, which is appropriate for a mule, who keeps his own counsel and requires no marker. Greer Hollow itself changed slowly and then quickly, the way change works in small valleys, a few new families arriving in the early years of the new century. The road improved, the church rebuilt in board and batten rather than rough log, a small school put up in 1906. The ledger I kept through those first winters was borrowed by Callum Daly when he was grown, and training young farmers from the Agricultural College in Blacksburg, and he used it as what he called a primary document, a term I found strange for a list of temperatures and a record of wood burned, but which meant that the numbers my father had taught me to read became part of what a room of young men learned about how cold moves through the earth, and what stone knows that wood does not, and why a structure built into a hillside is not a hole but a form of conversation with the ground itself, a listening that pays back over time. There was a winter in 1921, a cold one but not the coldest, when a journalist from the Roanoke paper came through the valley writing about old homestead methods and stopped at the Ravine structure, which Britt had brought him to see. And he asked her who had built it, and she told him. And he wrote down the name in his book, Dora Vane, widow, formerly of the Callaway parcel, and asked if I was living, and Britt said I was, and he asked where I lived now. And she pointed up the ridge to the bermed house, and he came and knocked, and I made him tea, and we sat by the east window where the winter light came in long and low. And he asked me many questions, most of which I answered in shorter form than he seemed to want, and at the end he asked what I thought had made the difference, and I sat for a moment with the cup warm in my hands and thought about my father's palm against the ravine wall, and the small patient smile and the single instruction, "Feel that, Dora." I said my father left me the understanding of it, and he left it to me the way a thing is best left, by showing me before he could tell me. The journalist wrote that down, and then looked out the window at the ridge, and then at the bermed north wall of my house, where it met the hillside. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "And it worked." "It did not fail," I said, which was the truer thing. The ridge where I have lived these past 20 years is different from the ravine in the way all high ground is different from sheltered ground, more exposed, more visible, less secret in its warmth. But the house knows the same principle, the berm and the vault and the depth and the stone, and in the worst Januaries, of which there have been 3 since I built it, the house has not gone below 34 at floor level, and I have burned less wood than any comparable house on the ridge, and the root cellar behind the north wall has never failed a vegetable or a jar of preserved summer that was placed inside it in sound condition. The principle holds because principles do not expire. They outlast the people who discover them, and the people who doubt them, and the people who copy them imperfectly. And they wait in the earth and the stone for whoever comes next, with their hand pressed flat against the cold face and the patience to feel what is there before they name it. The ravine structure still stands. I have not been down the switchback trail in several years, the knees being what they are at 61. But Britt goes, and she says the vault is sound, and the entrance post still carries the thermometer I nailed there in October of 1887, though the glass is clouded and the numbers cannot be read. The stone walls have settled where stone walls always settle, at the joints, but they have not failed, and the interior, Britt says, is cool in summer and close, and still in winter. The way a place is when the ground itself is tending it. Fenn's marker, such as it is a flat stone I pressed into the east wall without inscription, and it is still there, flush with the limestone, indistinguishable from the wall itself, which is exactly as I would have wanted. The thing my father taught me was not a design. It was a habit of attention, the willingness to put your hand against cold stone and wait, and trust what you felt before you decided what to build. Every winter I have lived since I first went down that trail with Cobb and the rope, and my hands raw and my boots soaked, has been a winter informed by that habit, and every January that has not broken me is evidence of something I cannot fully name, only feel, the way the stone feels warm from a great distance of heat, steadily, without asking to be noticed. The ravine is quiet in January now, as it was in all the Januaries before. The cold pools on the flat ground of the ridge and moves downhill in the dark, the way cold always moves, toward the lowest point, and the ravine catches it and holds it in the open air of the cut, and the stone walls of the structure beneath the vault hold against it the same way they have always held. The temperature differential steady through all the years since I measured it first and wrote the two numbers side by side in the ledger and understood what my father had been teaching me. The oak leaves come down in October and fill the ravine floor and rot into the soil that feeds the hemlock roots, and the creek runs in April and slows in August and freezes in January. The same creek, the same schedule, the same patient and indifferent working of water through stone that was there before I arrived, and will be there long after the thermometer's glass has gone completely dark. The knowing lives in the stone. It always did.